Welcome to this month's edition of the Water and Infrastructure Group. This month, we welcome Melissa von Mayrhauser. I hope I pronounced it right. Is a freshwater ecology PhD student at UC Berkeley, where she researches the ecological and social dimensions of restoration in urban rivers with a focus on Southern California. Central themes of her research include intermittent stream ecology, urban watershed management, and community-based biodiversity data collection. Previously, as a watershed programs manager at the NGO LA Waterkeeper, she tied together scientific fieldwork, policy change, and community participation to improve the health of the LA River and surrounding communities. She is an MSc in Water Science, Policy, and Management from the University of Oxford, and she's a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley right now. So big warm welcome for Melissa, and take it away. I'm going to mute myself and then you can.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Grace, and really thank you to all of you at the League of Women Voters of the Beach Cities for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you today. And yes, my name is Melissa von Mayrhauser, and as you mentioned, I'm speaking with you today as a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, and I'm excited to have this chance to speak with you about the relationship between river flows and ecosystem health in these two rivers, the Santa Clara and Los Angeles rivers, and how these flows and ecosystem relationships really relate to future restoration efforts that are particularly important in light of impacts of climate change in our region. I wanted to start off with a question for you that maybe we could return to at the end of the presentation. This is a question I think about a lot, and I would be very curious to hear your thoughts as well. So I'll return to this question a little bit later. So we're diving in here to these two watersheds, the LA River watershed and the Santa Clara River watershed. Many of you maybe live and work in these watersheds and are currently calling in from them right now. The Santa Clara River watershed is much larger. It's 1,200 square miles and has a main stem here of 84 miles. And it's, the LA River in contrast is 834 square miles and flows for around 51 miles. So they share this watershed boundary. They're sister rivers and watersheds, and they share a lot historically and culturally and hydrologically that we'll talk about today. Often these rivers are kind of seen as, they're not treated as part of the same story. And a lot of this is because we think of the LA River as being so degraded and urbanized in a way that the Santa Clara River is not. So we see this image on the bottom right of so much development that's right up to the edge of the LA River's levees that, so much of the river has been covered in concrete, as I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. And whereas the Santa Clara River is often called one of the last remaining wild or natural rivers in Southern California, even as there's sort of growing urbanization and development along its banks right now. So I think it's important actually to see two rivers like these in conversation with each other instead of viewing them as totally separate. And here here we have sort of a closer look at the Santa Clara River, which is also called the Utam River. This is the Chumash word for this river, since this river is in the ancestral homeland of the Chumash people. And Utam actually means phantom, which is referring to how water comes and goes. So like we see here in the first picture, we see this dry stream bed upstream in the watershed, which only really has flowed during rainstorms. And then at the bottom, closer to the bottom of the watershed, we see the site that has a lot of flow. And whenever I say flow, I'm referring to the amount of water that's in a river segment at a certain time. And then with the second picture here, this site has this regular flow as well. And a lot of that is from treated wastewater, also known as effluent. Here we have the LA River in a closer look. It's also called the Paime Pahait, which is the Tongva word, and that also Orit, the Tataviam word for the river. And the LA River is in the ancestral homeland of the Tongva and Tataviam First Nations people. And you may especially think of the river as we see it here in the upper left photo with a concrete lined stream segment. And but we also have parts of the LA River, like with number 2 here, where we have a soft sediment bottom. I think Kathy was talking about the Glendale Narrows earlier, and this is that segment. And actually, a lot of the flow here is not only coming from groundwater, but from treated wastewater as well, from 3 upstream wastewater treatment plants. And then here we have this section in Long Beach, which is also concrete lined, but gathers a lot of sediment, a lot of soil, and so has a sort of mud flat ecosystem here. So there are many expressions of these rivers when it comes to flows and habitats. And so yes, as I mentioned, these rivers are in the ancestral homeland of several First Nations tribes. And I think, as I think of these rivers and their flows, I think about these longstanding and current cultural connections between the Chumash and Tataviam and Tongva and Kizh people and these rivers. And, you know, here, for example, we see this image from an LA Times article showing the villages of the Tongva people and how many of them were along the LA River and its tributaries, showing that close connection. And I think this is a great article from Dr. Charles Sepulveda at the University of Utah, talking about that longstanding relationship, in this case, between the Tongva people and how their villages were located next to the river, and their identities were connected to these places geographically, genealogically, and through human-land relationships, and how these connections remain and have not been completely severed. So as I think about these rivers, a lot of what comes to my mind when I think of the flows is sort of this contrast between what we see during a lot of the year, which is on the left. This is a photo from 1900 in Northeast LA, where we see very low flows. And then, you know, we see in the image on the right a photo from 1926 during a flood, which is when we had suddenly a lot of water coming through the system in the very flashy way that we expect in Mediterranean climates. So we have this kind of contrast between low flows and high flows, depending on the time of year. And this is really important because so many of our native species have evolved in relation with these this kind of natural flow regime. And so when I say natural flow regime, I'm referring to this kind of characteristic pattern of flows over a year, not only in terms of the amount of flow, but also the timing and the amount of variability. And so for instance, willows and cottonwoods have evolved to release their seeds in synchrony with the spring flood recession. And some caddisfly families, have evolved to this behavior to move away from sort of treacherous areas during high flow events. And California quails are really adapted to living in arid climates with low flows, and they can get a lot of their moisture from insects and vegetation, for example. And of course, with so much of the development that has occurred in our region was not thinking about these flows, especially the high flows. So we have this image from 1940 in the Aleutian Valley, and just the amount of development that's right up to the edge of the LA River, regardless of flood risk. And one of the most iconic examples, of course, of the consequences is the series of floods in 1938, which we see here in both the LA River and the Santa Clara River. And it's just interesting to me when I look at a lot of the news headlines from this time, how many of them are about how, the river has demolished this, the river has caused certain deaths. The river is kind of demonized in a lot of cases as causing the problems, rather than thinking about the broader context of decision making. And I think we see this not only with high flows, but also with low flows. So on the left, we have this cartoon from the LA Daily Times at that point, showing this effort to get people on board with the decision to take water from the Owens River. And so we see, one can be seen with the naked eye, the other hard to find with a spyglass. So the idea was, oh, the LA River doesn't have very much flow, it doesn't count as a river, so we need to take this water from the Owens River instead. And this is sort of reinforced with this title from this article from 1905 saying Titanic project to give city a river, referring to the Owens River, regardless of the fact that the city already had a river in the LA River. And I think that a lot of this sort of dismissal of the river continues to this day and continues to inform a lot of our planning around the river. And this is an example of this that came from a posting from Friends of the LA River. They pointed out this billboard from a delivery service that says, calling yourself a cook is like calling the LA River a river, dinner, we get it. So kind of dismissing the river as not being a true river. And I think a lot of that comes from how we understand flow. And so, we've done a lot to change the flows in both of these rivers that we're discussing. And I'm sure you've discussed many aspects of these changes in past water and infrastructure group meetings. But yes, we have widespread development across the watershed, really decreasing the ability of water to get back into groundwater. And instead it's, flushing across the surface of our concrete covered landscape and down into our rivers and being flushed out to sea. We have many dams on both of these rivers that really change their flows. And on the right, we see an example of treated wastewater or effluent flowing from a facility in the Sepulveda Basin to the LA River. And this is part of what I'm going to focus on today. These are all river segments here, the ones on the left from the LA River, the one on the right from the Santa Clara River, that have flows that are primarily coming from treated wastewater. So all of these ecosystems have really changed quite a bit as a result of that. And this is a schematic showing these watersheds again. And the green is showing the areas where the majority of flows are currently coming from this treated wastewater. So quite a bit of the LA River main stem and some of the Santa Clara River as well before the water goes into the groundwater table. So I had novel ecosystems in the title, and this was referring to how we've made substantial changes to our ecosystems, including through the addition of treated wastewater, to the point that these ecosystems perhaps are differing quite a bit than any that we've seen before. And this is a concept in restoration ecology that I think is sometimes really beloved and sometimes hated, because it's describing this new state of our ecosystems that maybe doesn't reflect the reality that ecosystems are always changing and people have always played a role in that, for better or for worse. But at the same time, it's a way of sort of thinking about how, especially with climate change and other big human impacts, we're irrevocably changing our ecosystems. And a lot of how I'm thinking about these expressions, or maybe we're all thinking about an expression of climate change impacts right now, is in the drought that we're experiencing. And here on the left, we have the California Drought Monitor from just a few days ago, showing, for these study watersheds, that they are in a state of severe and extreme drought. And the whole state is really in a state of drought as well. And I'm sure you've also all been experiencing the record heat days that we've just had as well. So yes, following the most recent extreme drought that we had, the California State Water Resources Control Board implemented this new policy called the Water Quality Control Policy for Recycled Water. And they, as part of it, directed wastewater treatment facilities to consider recycling more of their treated wastewater rather than discharging as much of it into waterways. And given this directive, wastewater treatment facilities, sanitation districts in both the Santa Clara and LA River watersheds are considering or planning for reductions in the amount of effluent that they're going to be discharging. And you see some titles here about the LA River, and the plans there are farther along than on the Santa Clara River. But especially, we see here in both of these articles from Deborah Netburn and Louis Sahagan, that there are concerns, there are fears that the LA River would dry up, and fears about what that would mean for people's connections with these rivers. And with that in mind, there's been some research coming out of the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project to start thinking about what that would mean for aquatic life in the LA River. And I think, as we think about these fears and these concerns about what that would mean, I think a lot of it comes from how we've had, especially in the LA River, these heightened stabilized flows since the mid to late 20th century. And that's led to new opportunities maybe to connect with the river in different ways than before, like with kayaking and fishing in segments of the river that might otherwise be dry, birding to see wading birds. We see the continuation of the use of the river for cultural reasons, but I wanted to include these photos at the bottom because I was thinking about how people's access to these rivers is so varied, and oftentimes it's incredibly difficult to reach them for different reasons. On the LA River, because you see a lot of these signs saying, do not enter, you'll be imprisoned or fined. But at the same time, we have an image of Mayor Garcetti, happily kayaking down a verdant section of the river with a lot of kind of flow in a bucolic setting. So as though it's extremely easy to access. So as we think about these questions, I wanted to just remind us of the unequal access that we have to the river. So in my research, I'm thinking about how we can use effluent and urban runoff as tools of urban river restoration. And I especially like this because I think so often we immediately think, okay, it's effluent, it's urban runoff, it's immediately bad, or it's causing some harm, which in some cases it is. But I think that, in addition to watershed-wide restoration efforts, like removing concrete whenever possible, and daylighting storm drains and a variety of other efforts, we can use especially effluent as a tool to work on this broader project of restoring aquatic and riparian habitat as part of climate change mitigation. So you might ask what I mean by that. And this is a water graph or a hydrograph showing this example from the work of Sarah Yarnell of, in the blue here, the change in the discharge, otherwise known as flow, in a sort of example river like the LA River or the Santa Clara River over the course of a year. And you see that the blue is the natural flow regime, which I mentioned to you earlier was this characteristic pattern of flows that we would expect in a certain waterway, in a certain watershed. So we have the blue here, and I'm going to get back to the red line in a minute. But first, I wanted to show you this USGS stream gauge. It's from along the LA River. It's by Sepulveda Dam. And here we also see discharge or the amount of flow over the period of a year. But you can see compared to the last graph we looked at, and I'll set up a comparison as well in a minute, but we have kind of these higher flows that are pretty consistent over the course of a year without a lot of variation. And, some a little bit when maybe there's a big storm, but in general, with the dam and especially effluent discharges, the flows are kind of kept very stable. So we see a big change difference between what we might see in a natural flow regime without as much human intervention, and then what we're seeing in reality. And part of the work of Sarah Yarnell is looking at how we can possibly use different tools to mimic the natural flow regime. And so the red line here is this functional flow where we're trying to recreate parts of what we would expect in a more natural system. And this is so important because these flows are really driving a lot of what we're seeing in terms of ecosystem health in our rivers. And so flows, how much we restore flows, such as here in this paper by Margaret Palmer and my advisors, Albert Rui, we see that there are so many ways we can approach restoring flows, maybe altering the pattern of reservoir releases or restoring watersheds, or even better sort of using wastewater effluent that we have as a way of affecting all sorts of different ecosystem processes that could then help us to restore our rivers. So this is also important because I showed you this image earlier from this work by Lytle and Poff, and we could do much more to kind of regulate when we are discharging flows from wastewater treatment plants, not just in terms of the amount of flow, but also the timing. Like, for instance, releasing effluent discharges as an extension of sort of mimicking when we would have the spring flood recession. And so there would be a better chance for cottonwood and willow seeds to germinate. And some of the watershed-wide interventions would help in terms of, for instance, some caddisfly families, if we had lower flows coming through the river during flood events. And we could do a lot more with trying to recognize the different adaptations of native bird species and make changes to the flows to match their needs as well. And a lot of this is really connected to this exciting world in restoration ecology around process-based restoration. And for so long, starting, several decades ago, there was a lot of interest in restoring rivers in terms of creating this ideal river space. Like, let's design the perfect oxbow, or let's, have perfectly stable banks. But time and time again, the river would sort of take back that area and destroy the perfect form. And there's more and more of this sense that, as we see in this article, that when we allow the dynamic forces, like with the flows, to create and maintain the ecosystem function, then we can do so much more with our restoration. So the example on the right is from the Aire River in Switzerland, and showing this example on the left of kind of preparing the floodplain for the first flood of the season, and then letting the water do the work in self-restoring, letting the river restore itself. So some really exciting work that's happening in LA with process-based restoration is the work of Melanie Winter at the River Project. And recently she and her team put out the Sepulveda Basin Restoration Feasibility Report. And it's a really exciting sort of look at how we can open up opportunities for the river to restore itself, removing concrete, increasing opportunities for groundwater recharge, and really reconnecting people with the river, such as through creating cultural spaces and a trail system. And I don't know how many of you have spent a lot of time in the Sepulveda Basin, but from my experience, it's very difficult to get to the river, and just imagining being able to immediately be able to access the river and enjoy a healthier river as well, and for everyone else to be able to do that is pretty exciting. And then we have some examples here of times when research has looked at how effluent can play this really important ecological role. So this is some exciting work from Michael Bogan and his team, where they're looking at how effluent can play this important role in the Santa Cruz River in Tucson, Arizona, and looking at sort of the diverse assemblages of dragonflies that have colonized areas with effluent discharge compared to areas where it's dry. And we have this work from Jacqueline White and Juliet Stromberg, where they're looking at the Salt River in Arizona and showing how both effluent and storm drain runoff can really be important tools in the restoration of this urban dryland river. I think an example that contrasts with these process-based restoration ideas is the project we were discussing earlier with Frank Gary's plan for covering part of the river in concrete. And we can talk more about this, but I think this quote from him says a lot. And he talks about this idea that he was looking to brand the river and give it visual coherence. And he says, if he could do that, then the river could become something special. And I think with a lot of the amazing work that's happening and has been happening for quite a while on the river, there's this recognition that the river already is special, and there's a lot that we can do to accentuate the kind of amazing parts of the ecosystem and our connection with it. So in my research, I'm really looking at how changing flows along these two rivers are related to changes in bug, bird, and plant communities, as well as to changes in people's perceptions of these waterways. And this is a reach or part of the Santa Clara River that sometimes has flow and sometimes does not. So it's interesting to see those changes. Here's the schematic again, showing these two waterways in terms of the flow variability in their main stems. Excuse me. And essentially, when I started this research, I was looking at sort of monitoring sites that have different habitats and different flows. And so I was looking at sites that are both upstream and downstream of effluent, so I could see the difference when we add effluent versus not, and looking at sites with different habitats like concrete lined, soft bottom, and unconstrained as well. So this is to show you where my study sites are located, sort of a gradient along these main stems in general. And to tell you a bit about the study design, essentially, I'm taking a 180-meter section of each of these sites, and then collecting aquatic invertebrate samples, so looking at bugs living in the flows themselves. So for instance, mayflies, dragonflies, true flies, and caddisflies. So collecting samples from these different locations within this stream reach, and then also setting up traps to collect terrestrial bugs. So these include ants, spiders, and beetles. And these are, traps that I set up in the same area, areas where I do the aquatic invertebrate or aquatic bug monitoring. And these are essentially plastic containers with a saltwater soap solution and then aluminum ramps. And then I'm taking all of these bug samples back to the lab, and I've been working with a team of undergraduates to identify them taxonomically. And at these same sites, I'm also doing bird surveys on different days and looking at the diversity and abundance of bird species living in these sites and using them. And as well as doing vegetation monitoring, looking at the composition of species, so the types of species, as well as the amount of structure that they provide. So like habitat structure that could be useful for birds, for instance. And with this work, we're really interested in the food web more broadly. So instead of a focus on a particular species of concern, we're looking at the connections between the plant life, the bug life, and the bird life to see how they all relate to each other and how they relate to the flows in each of these segments. And this is a picture of some of my teammates, some people who've joined me in the field, and really thankful for their support. And so I'm collecting all of these data sets, but in addition to that, I think I'm working to position the work within a broader watershed context. And to do that, I'm bringing in other sources of data that are very helpful, like USGS stream gauge data, and satellite image data that could help me to identify more about the plant life and the amount of water flowing through these rivers. And there's really a rich collection, a rich abundance of aquatic bug data from the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition. And then I'm also using data from these two data sets, and maybe you've used these apps quite a bit before, but it's with iNaturalist and eBird. These are great ways for anyone to kind of log on and then record species observations and contribute to this data set that's really important for a lot of scientists' work. So I, yes, love to talk more about eBird and iNaturalist as well. So if I'm looking upstream and downstream of these effluent discharges and really looking at whether the communities of bugs, for instance, are less or more abundant and less or more diverse upstream or downstream, and starting to look at their traits. So for instance, this is from some data that I collected in July 2021, looking at the percentage of my samples that were from these very pollution intolerant aquatic bugs. So these are bugs that I would only expect to find in areas where there were really high quality conditions in the streams, with EPT meaning Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera, these 3 orders of aquatic bugs. And it's interesting to start to see, following the addition of effluent, this increase in the proportion of these bugs that are much more pollution sensitive. And also following the addition of effluent on the LA River, this decrease in dipterans, which are these true flies that are in contrast to the Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, Trichoptera that I just showed you. These dipterans are really pollution. They're really they're very tolerant of pollution, much more so. So we would expect to find them in more degraded, polluted sites. And here we see this decrease in the abundance of them after the addition of effluent. So these are just some initial snapshots of what we're starting to see. And we're starting to look at this as well. This is sort of a look at how we're interested in bird abundances and diversity upstream and downstream of effluent discharges and in sites with just very different flow levels as well. And as we go through the data, and I'm still in the data collection process very much so, but I would like to ask questions about sort of what flow and habitat conditions we would need for certain bird species to survive, for example. And for instance, if we wanted, we could think about this in terms of how we could restore habitat, especially for endangered species like the least Felis vireo that we have here, another important species. So yes, I think it's really important that we think about river flows and the biodiversity that they support as we consider the meaning of restoration in our region's rivers. And I think so often it's overlooked in a lot of our planning efforts. So I hope it can become more of a centerpiece. And I also hope that in the future we can consider new approaches to managing flows, such as changing the way that we discharge effluent in our region's rivers. Okay, so I wanted to maybe return to this original question for our discussion about what river restoration means to you, and perhaps also what flows you would like to see in local rivers, and perhaps leave that for our discussion. And in the meantime, like to, again, thank you for this opportunity to speak today, and thank you to the groups that are providing funding to me, as well as to everyone who has helped me in the lab and in the field as well. Thank you so much.